Hey everyone, this is Miss Valentine, and you are watching the 5.1 notes presentation on energy flow in ecosystems. What that means is basically how do living things, both plants and animals, obtain the energy that they need to do all of their cellular functions? And how does that energy move from one organism through another? That's what this section is all about. And I just want to point out that this elusive tiger squirrel is not an actual animal, just a fun mix-up, mashup that was created. I didn't want you going on believing that that's a real thing. All right, so our first source of the energy that we use in our cells actually comes from the sun. So even the energy that you are using to think and write and listen and all the things that you do originally came from sunlight. Now it changes form over the course of time through different means, and that's what we're going to talk about today. But the sun, if we didn't have the sun, we wouldn't have life. So we need the sunlight. It enters the earth and comes into the ecosystem, is captured by plants. So plants are considered producers. They produce their own food from the sunlight, as well as water and carbon dioxide, which we'll look at in another slide. But the photosynthesis is the key process that gives organisms like us, consumers, our energy when we eat those producers. So we can't go out in the sun and just lay there and make our own food. Though wouldn't it be really cool if we could? We need to eat plants that have done photosynthesis in order to get that energy. Either that, or we can eat organisms that have eaten plants. So it has to pass on up to us. We can't make our own food, unlike plants. So the process of photosynthesis can be done by plants, algae, and some bacteria. And again, it's sunlight, carbon dioxide, and water. All of that goes together to produce carbohydrates or sugars. The main one for plants is glucose. And then oxygen is a byproduct, it's a waste product of photosynthesis. And lucky for us, most animals rely on oxygen now, with the exception of really small ones near thermal vents in the ocean. But oxygen is a waste product for plants that we can use instead. You guys are going to write the equation in the circles on your notes handout. So it is 6 carbon dioxide molecules, so get that from the atmosphere, plus 6 water molecules, which you get when you water plants. That's the water that they need. And then solar energy. Those 3 things are put together. There's a chemical reaction, and you end up with C6H12O6, which is glucose or sugar. And then, like I said, oxygen is the waste product. So again, make sure you're writing out this formula. And it's interesting to think, but most of the sugar that is created comes from the carbon dioxide. You need that carbon. So it's coming from the air. Solid sugar or the materials that make up our cells, they come from the air. Most of the mass of plants comes from gas. It's pretty cool. All right, so this picture is just showing those things going in: sunlight, carbon dioxide, and water. And then the plants inside their cells are changing it into glucose or sugar and oxygen. So once again, there it is, the equation that you wrote down on your notes handout. All right, so here we are at our first pit stop. You can pause the video at this point and answer the question, where does all energy in an ecosystem originally come from? All right, so we start with the plants or other producers gathering that sunlight, turning it into sugar, and then that energy can then be passed on to consumers or organisms that consume the plants or other organisms. So because plants make their own food, they're called producers. There's another word that you may have heard in biology class called autotrophs or self-feeders. So they're feeding themselves. They create that sugar, and then they can then use that sugar to feed themselves. So you sometimes hear them called self-feeders. So the producers then pass this energy onto what we call consumers. Consumers are organisms that get their energy by eating other organisms. So we, humans, and all other animals are consumers. We can't make our own energy, so we have to consume it. A consumer eats other organisms or organic matter instead of making their own nutrients, or they basically get their nutrients from consuming things. So that's the root of the word consumer. There's another word for consumer you may have learned in biology class, heterotroph, or other feeders, meaning they feed on others, or they feed on either the producers or other consumers. So cannot make our own food. We have to consume others in order to maintain all of our cell functions. So some producers can get their energy directly from the sun by absorbing it through their leaves. So that's our plants. Other organisms, consumers, get their energy indirectly by eating producers or other consumers. We're not directly getting it from the sun. So this little baby here is getting the energy, the sugars from this plant that it's eating. And that is a great example of how we consumers get it indirectly. And I do believe that's one of the questions on your quiz about whether organisms get it directly or indirectly from the sun. So just remember, producers get it directly from the sun because they can do photosynthesis, and then consumers get their energy indirectly by eating other producers or eating consumers. So there's one exception to the rule, and that's in deep ocean communities. So there's different deep ocean thermal vents that go through something called chemosynthesis. And that is where no light is available, and so they make their own food using the chemicals that are available to them. Producers in this environment are bacteria, and they use hydrogen sulfide as their fuel. That's how they produce their food. Other underwater organisms in that environment can then eat the bacteria or the organisms that ate that bacteria. So it's another food chain that is very different from what we normally see here close to the surface of the Earth. Here we are at our next pit stop. So pause the video to write your response to the question, what is the difference between producers and consumers? So the next question when we're trying to figure out how energy flows through ecosystems is very basic: what eats what? Consumers are classified by what they eat. So we have herbivores, which are plant eaters, and they eat only producers. So think of herbs. Herbs are a plant. Herbivores eat plants. So this would be rabbits or cows. Carnivores will then eat those consumers. So they eat the primary consumers or the herbivores. So carnivores eat only other consumers. Lions and hawks are a good example. And sometimes you hear them called apex predators because they are at the top of the food chain. So carnivores is another category. Then you have organisms that eat both plants and animals, or plants or producers and consumers. So this would be like bears, which eat fruits and berries in addition to salmon and other meat. Pigs and cockroaches are even omnivores. They will eat either flesh or plants. And then we, of course, are omnivores. So if you have both the ability to eat plants and meat, you're considered an omnivore. And something interesting about human evolution is that our teeth are actually evolved to eat about 80% plants and 20% meat is what evolutionary scientists believe. That's what we see in our mouths. That's what we were meant to eat, is about 80% plants and about 20% flesh. Of course, it seems to kind of go the other way. A lot of people eat 80% meat and 20% plants. So very different. Decomposers are another category, and these are organisms that eat dead organisms or wastes. So they help decompose things, break things down, and return it to the soil or the water or the air. So bacteria and fungi are often decomposers. They eat either dead organisms or just dead waste. I guess it would be waste material from other organisms. So this table is one that you would see in our textbook. It shows you what the producer and the consumer makes, some examples, and you will need to know some examples for your quiz. So you may want to take a look at this table more closely in your textbook. And then also some descriptions of herbivores, carnivores, omnivores, and decomposers. These are the general basic categories. And then we're going to talk a little bit about primary consumer, secondary consumer, tertiary consumer. So other terms that you're going to need to know when it comes to what eats what in an ecosystem. Here we are at another pit stop. You can pause the video and answer the question. What type of consumers are humans, and what does that say about what we eat? Now, when we are consuming food, when we're consuming this energy, we can store it in our bodies, which a lot of us do. That's oftentimes what the fat is, or muscle, depending on if you're using it to build muscle. But we can either store it or we can burn it. You are doing that right now. Just thinking and writing things down as we speak, you are burning that fuel, that glucose in general from the breakfast that you ate today or the lunch you ate or whenever you had your last meal. You can also draw on the fat storage that you have in your body. So we obtain our energy from the food we eat, but it has to be broken down within the body. And if you remember from biology, there was another formula that was the opposite of photosynthesis, and that's the one that we use to burn the fuel. So if you remember from biology class, when you break down food to make the energy, it's called cellular respiration. So that was photosynthesis is creating the sugar, and then cellular respiration is using that sugar. So this is done in both plants and in animals. It's done in all organisms that use cellular respiration, and it's generally in the presence of oxygen is when cellular respiration happens. So you have to have oxygen. It's a very efficient way of taking sugar molecules and breaking them down and then turning them into brain power and movement and all of the different things that we do. So cellular respiration is how we burn the fuel that we got from eating. It is how cells produce their energy from carbohydrates, so sugar, glucose. What happens, again, it's the reverse of photosynthesis. You have oxygen combining with the sugar to form water, carbon dioxide, and then you also get the energy in the form of ATP. If you guys remember that term from biology, that was adenosine triphosphate. So that's the energy molecule in organisms. So cellular respiration is inside the cells of most organisms. The exception would be fermentation, alcoholic fermentation, and what's the other one? Lactic acid fermentation. So fermentation is where you don't have oxygen available. So that's your anaerobic respiration is what we call it. You guys are again copying down the formula for this is cellular respiration instead of photosynthesis. So, but just remember, it's just the opposite of photosynthesis, only instead of having sunlight in there, which is what producers use, you are creating energy using the sugar. So the C6H12O6 or glucose plus 6 oxygen molecules, which we get by breathing in the air, that produces 6 carbon dioxide molecules, which we exhale out of our bodies. 6 water molecules, which we also either have in our bodies, keep in our bodies, or we exhale water vapor as well. And then we have the energy that we need to write things down, to think, to move, to do all of the things that we do. And this is one of the reasons why if you don't eat, you feel really tired and really unable to move and just exhausted because you don't have that energy readily able to burn. It takes some time for your body to actually break down the fat and produce energy from it. It's much more efficient to eat and get your energy and then use it. So now part of the energy in cell respiration is used to carry out all of the things that we do, like I've mentioned. Breathing, moving, thinking is even an activity that you need a lot of glucose for. Excess energy is stored as fat. So our body automatically does that. That's an evolutionary thing that we developed to be able to survive. because if you think about it, food was not always readily available early in our evolution. So fat was actually something that helped organisms to survive if they were able to store it, if they were able to keep that energy available. But nowadays we have a problem with too much energy. We eat too much, and we have this fat that is now unhealthy for us. So keep that in mind if you are an athlete and you drink Gatorade. The reason you're drinking that Gatorade is to help you be active and move. But when you're just sitting down, not doing anything, drinking that Gatorade will actually turn into fat very rapidly. So keep that in mind when you guys are drinking Gatorade. It's not healthy for you unless you are actually burning those calories, unless you're actually burning that sugar. All right, here is our next pit stop. You can pause the video and answer the question, what is cellular respiration and why is it important? All right, so let's talk a little bit about how the energy transfers or moves through the ecosystem. This is what we are ultimately going for in this section. Each time an organism eats another organism, you have an energy transfer occurring. So the energy that is within one organism is transferred into the next organism. But we have a special name for these different transfers. So we call them trophic levels. So as you move up trophic levels, that is when one organism is eating another organism. So when the grasshopper eats the plant, that's moving up a trophic level. When the mouse is eating a grasshopper, that's moving up a trophic level. And when the snake eats the mouse, you're moving up another trophic level. And we're going to see in a few slides that the energy transferred is not the same. You don't get this grasshopper is not going to get the 10,000 joules. That's what the unit of energy is. It's not going to get 10,000 joules of energy from eating the plant. It's only going to get 1,000 joules. So the energy decreases as you move up trophic levels. I think that's in a coming slide. Food chains are modeled in this trophic level way. So you start at the bottom of the food chain or the bottom trophic level, and then as organisms eat one another, you're moving up trophic levels. A food chain is a sequence in which energy is transferred from one organism to the next as each organism eats another organism. So the krill is eating the algae. Krill is just a type of shrimp or similar to shrimp. Cod will eat the krill, and that energy gets transferred to the cod. The leopard seal eats the cod, and that energy gets transferred to the leopard seal. But again, remember, it's not the same amount of energy. It's a smaller amount. Finally, by the time the killer whale eats the leopard seal, there's a lot less energy available to feed that killer whale. So you usually have a lot more organisms at the bottom than you do at the top because they get their energy directly from the sun here at the bottom, while the organisms further up have to eat and get less energy from the ones that they eat. Now, food chains are not, usually you don't have just one food chain in an ecosystem. There are usually many food chains that work off of one another, and that's called a food web. So a web shows many feeding relationships that are possible in an ecosystem. So what could eat what is more of the question in a food web. So it's many food chains together in a food web. So you'll need to know that a food chain is a linear sequence or a line. A food chain, think of like a chain being held out in a line. So a food chain is a linear sequence, a line. A food web is a web. It's got many different feeding relationships instead. So here's a picture of a food web. You can see the original food chain that I was showing a few slides back. The food web is much more complex, much more complicated. All right, so again, trophic levels are what we were talking about in the previous slide. So each step up is a transfer of energy when one organism eats something lower in the trophic level or on a lower trophic level. So it's just one step in a food chain or in a food pyramid. Examples would include moving from producers to primary consumers, and then secondary consumers, and then tertiary consumers. So there's different types of consumers that we'll talk about, but producers, there's just one producer that makes their energy from sunlight or chemicals if it's in the ocean. And then there's different types of consumers depending on if those consumers are eating producers or if they're eating other consumers. So we'll talk a little bit about that in the next few slides. So here you see the producers are at the bottom. They make their energy from the sun. The primary consumers, they eat the producers. So anytime you see primary, think of first, kind of like in primary school, you're in like the first grade, second grade. So that's primary, is the first to eat the energy, to get the energy from the producers. A secondary consumer is one that eats a primary consumer. So they are not getting their energy directly from the producers, and you can see they're getting a lot less energy because they aren't eating the producers directly, they're eating primary consumers instead. And then at the very top, you have tertiary consumers. This is the name for consumers that eat secondary consumers. So they are even farther removed from the original energy source. So tertiary consumers, there's usually a lot fewer of them in an ecosystem because they have so little energy that they get from what they eat. So each time energy is transferred, a lot of the energy is lost as heat. Now, some of it is used by, let me go back to this picture. Some of the energy is used by these organisms here. So, of course, the plants have to do their own cellular respiration. So they use up some of the energy that they made. You pass that on to the next level. Some of it is lost as heat, and some of it is used by the organism. So less energy is available the higher up you go in trophic levels. So that is why eating plants can actually give you a lot more energy. Now, it doesn't always stick with you as long, so that's why eating a salad doesn't make you feel as full as eating a steak. The steak takes a longer time to digest. But the plants are actually giving you more energy by weight of what you're eating. So as you move up the food chain, energy is lost as you move up, and it's about 10%. And we'll talk about that in the next slide here, where we look at an energy pyramid. The energy pyramid is the slide that I showed you at the very beginning of talking about these food chains, food webs, and we'll take a look at that again. So here is an energy pyramid. The sun shines on the earth, giving it 1,000,000 joules of sunlight. Again, joules are just a unit of energy, kind of like calories are. So 1,000 joules or 1,000,000 joules of sunlight. The primary producers, the plants, are only able to make 10,000 joules out of that 1,000,000 joules. When the grasshopper eats the plant, they're only getting 10% of the energy from the plant. When the mouse eats the grasshopper, they're only getting 10% of the energy that the grasshopper had. And when the snake eats the mouse, they're only getting 10% of the energy that the mouse had. So you have a very small amount of energy passing to these top consumers, these tertiary consumers. So each layer represents a trophic level. Producers form the base of the energy pyramid and therefore have the most energy. Like I said, this means that when you eat plants, you're getting a lot more energy in the weight of the plant that you're eating. The pyramid becomes smaller towards the top because less energy is available. You don't have as much energy to feed those organisms, so it can't support that many organisms. Keep that up there for just a moment. So the amount of energy in a trophic level determines how many organisms that you can actually have in that level in the ecosystem. So your apex predators at the very top of the energy pyramid, the snakes, the hawks, the things that eat other consumers, they are much smaller in number than like your mice or your deer, your primary consumers. So once again, here's a diagram showing the number of producers. There's 1,000 blades of grass to feed this many 100 grasshoppers. And those 100 grasshoppers feed 10 birds. And then those 10 birds feed one hawk. Sorry, I'm like trying to think of all these names while I'm talking. All right, so here we are at another pit stop. Please pause the video while you answer the question. What happens to the amount of energy transferred when a consumer eats something? So energy loss does affect how the ecosystems are structured. Because the energy is decreasing as you move up trophic levels, the organization of the ecosystem is affected. It affects the number of organisms at each level, like we talked about a few slides back. Energy loss limits the number of trophic levels in an ecosystem. So if there is not enough energy, let's say there's not enough producers to create food from sunlight, then you're going to have a lot fewer animals in that ecosystem. This is really common up near the poles, especially where there's not as much sunlight, there's not as many plants to produce energy. You see a lot less diversity, a lot less types of animals and plants in the area. The same is true for along the equator in the rainforest. You have tons of different types of animals and plants because there is plenty of sunlight, plenty of warmth, plenty of plants to feed an entire ecosystem. So the way that ecosystems look depends completely on its ability to capture energy and then pass that energy along to other organisms in the ecosystem. Okay, so here we are at our final slide. So you guys are going to write a 5-sentence summary about the notes. Read through the whole notes packet again and make sure you get things from both day 1 and day 2 of the notes, or part 1 and part 2 of the notes if you broke it up. I'm looking for 5 sentences about how energy flows through ecosystems.